Okay. Well, I again appreciate the opportunity to join the FLC in this conversation. Certainly something that's important in any way that we can collaborate and leverage the great knowledge that the labs bring forward on various issues. Glad to contribute to that dialogue. So I'm going to talk a little bit different, and not about the actual water itself, but the means by which that critical lifeline service is provided, and new ways in which the virtual world is influencing the capabilities of utilities like Kurt and those that Lisa spoke about to provide that service. So to illustrate that point, we have what I would call a complex and evolving system of systems. And as the graphic implies here, probably in the 1970s and 80s when SCADA systems at utilities were being installed to allow for telemetry of data about tank levels and things of that nature, a virtual attack from the kid down the street or the malevolent actor in some foreign nation was not really well conceived of, nor really thought about as a reality. However, as this system of systems has evolved, in part due to some of the budgetary issues that Kurt talked about, workforce compression, and some of the efficiencies, operational efficiencies afforded to them with things like big data that Elisa alluded to, that also creates exposure to different set of risks that may not have been conceived of before. And so in some case we have these legacy systems that were not designed with security in mind, because quite frankly it would take a very sophisticated actor back in that period of time to perpetrate an attack. But as we now have everything from our water systems to our refrigerator on the internet, which I still can't quite figure out the need for the last one, but that's here nor there. That creates some opportunity. So from a process control perspective, and the advanced metering technologies that are now available both in the power sector and that essentially a similar platform is being applied in the water sector, the supervisory control and data acquisition systems that are used by utilities to essentially remotely manage pump stations and tank levels and pumps and things of that nature. That creates some connectivity, the communication networks that are involved with that. And then, the enterprise system is a little bit separate thing. And one of the challenges we have there, now with everybody having a computer at their desk, quite frankly, people like to click on stuff, so that human intervention role becomes increasingly complicated as some of the attack vectors are increasingly sophisticated in their social engineering. So the risk there is not only becomes a pathway into those process control systems, which get at the operational side of the utility and their ability to deliver drinking water or treat wastewater, but also the enterprise side where, there's employee payroll data and the finance aspects of the utility, customer billing information, so how personal information is being protected, and then, the laboratory information that the utility uses for compliance. These are all things that could perceivably become a target of a malicious attack, or even a not so malicious attack that's just opportunity with simple things like ransomware and things of that nature. So this kind of physical, virtual kind of interface is something that is evolving and emerging, and we've been doing some things that I'm going to talk about here in a moment to elevate the capability of the sector to deal with that. So as I said, folks like to click on stuff. This comes from some information from Verizon, who has done quite a bit of work in this space in investigating the modes of attack and what kinds of things happen. And as you can see here, in many cases, attackers are able to do this very quickly. The email thing with phishing links, it seems like, hey, Bob from accounting said we got to pay this bill, and you didn't really realize that the email address was slightly off, but it seemed legit, so you went ahead and paid it. And these aren't things this isn't data that's, I should say, is exclusive to the water sector. This is kind of a global look from Verizon's knowledge set. But I think the bullet here that's most troubling, and I'll get to it as we talk a little bit more, is that in 70% of the cases, the attacks exploited vulnerabilities that have had known mitigation strategies available for more than a decade. And that, that in itself is very important, but also is one of the conundrums that the water sector has, and is perhaps an opportunity for the labs to provide some knowledge and support in some of these things. And then, as you can see, with the breaches, in this case, it's a little bit more focused. This data says probably on things like Target and Home Depot, but it's very costly for an entity to incur that kind of thing in terms of their operations and kind of the financial impacts of that. So from a water sector perspective, we've been involved in the conversation for quite some time, and I've always said that the first time the sector probably really looked at the vulnerability of their systems to a cyber type of situation was with Y2K, and thankfully that didn't really come to pass, and perhaps that was a missed opportunity, but that was probably the first kind of deep dive, if you will, that utilities took in that. And then with the Bioterrorism Act of 2002, at least on the drinking water side, amongst other things, those utilities were required to at least evaluate the vulnerabilities or risks from a malevolent cyber-based attack. As we worked with utilities and post 9/11 and started to evaluate different strategies for utilities to deal with security and preparedness, what I would call left a boom or right a boom, there became a realization that our capabilities and really understanding in terms of cybersecurity was sort of not moving along very progressively. And so in collaboration with the Department of Homeland Security, AWWA convened a group of SMEs to develop this roadmap, which was really, in essence, a kind of a gap assessment and kind of like where are the challenges. And so one of those things was the need for an integrated template of security protocols that was exclusive to the water sector. And then, not to get into the weeds, but a collaboration of the water sector associations in partnership with EPA and DHS and others did this roadmap in 2013 where the number one priority was advancing development of sector-specific cybersecurity resources. So AWWA as an ANSI standards development organization has tried to help fill that information need and knowledge gap and institutionalize some good protocols. So in a number of our standards and I guess guidance or management practice that I'll hit on here real quickly, try to emphasize that amongst all the things that are necessary for security practices, for operations and management, for example, in the G430 standard, that information protection and continuity is a required aspect or element of a good utility operations. In the J100 Risk and Resilience Management standard, cybersecurity is a threat domain that those following that methodology are asked to integrate into their system. And quite frankly, I would argue that of all the possible threats facing a water system. The cyber threat is probably, from a probability perspective, the one that's closest to the value of 1 of anything, because of the proliferation of and simplicity of delivering some very simple ransomware things to any employee in the system just through the email network, for example. In our G440 standard on emergency preparedness, again, talk about those considerations of business and operating systems recovery. So, once it does happen, how do you recover payroll and things of that nature? And do you have a plan, to recover some of those either physical or virtual assets? A little bit dated now, but, following the impacts of Katrina in New Orleans, the water utility was asked to reconstruct, their most recent billing system. And, well, lo and behold, while most things in New Orleans are below sea level, that whole system was flooded out, so it became very difficult because there wasn't a backup system off-site somewhere, and perhaps things like the cloud can also be a means by which a utility could overcome some of that. Business continuity planning, again, a very important aspect of utility operations, and again, kind of looking beyond some of the more tactical things from that an emergency response plan may cover, but kind of get into some of those overall business planning features and long-term strategic planning. In that process, we've integrated the concept of cyber recovery planning as a required action item. And last but not least, the one that I'll focus most of my time on here for the balance is some guidance we issued in 2014 and have recently updated process control system security guidance for the water sector. Again, here trying to address that gap I noted in our 2008 roadmap. And the important thing to note here is that this guidance is in direct alignment with the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, which was evolved out of an executive order here in 2014. And I think our resources that I'll describe here in a moment were some of the first that provide a sector-specific approach to supporting the voluntary implementation of that framework. But that does not come without some challenges that perhaps, as I said, the labs could be supportive of. So, Executive Order 13636 called for the development of cybersecurity for critical infrastructure, a few different kind of levels of activity, but what I would say is that while NIST did an excellent job in organizing a very diverse set of existing standards and practices for many utility systems that are not technologists, if you will, it was a bit daunting to kind of figure out how exactly do I apply this to my system. And so we had the luxury, if you will, of developing our guidance as that process was going on, and took what I would call a utility-driven approach, since we were able to focus solely on the water sector, and organize the information that is mapped into the NIST framework, that is based on how the utility uses the technology to run their system. If you go back to that graphic that I shared with you at the beginning of the presentation, they don't necessarily need to be a specialist in every possible PLC or RTU that might be available, but they need to be able to say, I need to get data from this point to this point. Therefore, what do I need to do? So the guidance here really outlines a number of about 12 different, what I would call perhaps domain areas that are important for utility managers to understand. So Kurt and his colleagues, for example. And it's important to understand that the output of this process, and I'll talk about the tool that complements the guidance here in a second, it's not an evaluation of the utility security profile, but it provides the utility with a means for self-evaluation, in the sense that the most simple example is Kurt or another utility, they want to remotely manage their pump station because it's really cold in Alaska in the middle of winter, or for much of the year as well. But so I don't want to go out there and check the gauges and valves at 3 a.m. in the middle of December. So if I'm going to do that, then what do I need to do from a security perspective? So if you click that use case, the person filling out the form would get a prioritized list of controls that then empowers them to go back and say, gee, have we done these things or not? And if not, what's the path forward to doing that? So it really is designed to enable folks to implement good risk management practices. So again, as I said, the use case tool covers 82 cybersecurity controls, and it maps directly back into the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. So we didn't create anything new. In fact, we may have added some things that were more germane to, say, some of the other business management practices that are within the water sector's guidance and standards to help round out some different areas. But again, so the prioritization scheme derived from a number of water utility sector subject matter experts, came to a consensus conclusion that, if you're doing this activity, then these are the controls that are most applicable, and we prioritize them, right? Just like most people put their socks on before their shoes. Same kind of concept here. Do these priority one activities first if you haven't done them. So that's your basic cyber hygiene that would apply to any utility of any size if you're doing this particular activity. If not, and something comes up as a priority 2, 3, or 4, well, then perhaps it's appropriate to sequence that in a manner that is sensitive to the budget limitations. You can't do everything at once, but if we do this first, then maybe we can do this one next year, and maybe in the fourth quarter or something like that, so that you can stage this out and begin to build a robust cybersecurity risk management program that is applicable to your system. And so what we have found since we launched this in 2014 and recently updated it here in the last year to deal with some use cases that we hadn't considered previously, is that some systems have used this as a standalone tool to identify what they need, because it really helps them get their hands around the beast, if you will. And then a number of utilities have also then used it in a more mature manner, in the sense that they've already got some programs, so they've used the tool to help validate what they're doing and do some internal verification of where they might need to do some things next and identify some improvements for their existing programs. So we wouldn't say that the AW guidance is the end-all be-all, but it's certainly an excellent entry point that lowers the barrier of entry, if you will, in a very simplistic way that is not intimidating to a system that may not be familiar with the details of all the different standards that NIST and other entities have developed. And once they get to that point and they're feeling a little more mature, they can evolve into using something like the CSET tool, which I do recall evolved out of the water sector many moons ago. There's a little bit more in-depth kind of investigation of your actual systems. And then with support from ICS CERT, can even step up into these other more really in-depth kind of investigations of your network and access controls and things of that nature. But we believe that the guidance that we've developed is a good kind of baseline to get things moving along. Where we see the challenges that we're taking some actions as well as EPA to address, but still I think there's certainly plenty of opportunity for the labs to be involved in some of this stuff, but education and capacity development, building awareness of not just the threat, but the potential consequence of this. And so, unlike more physical security things where, they require proximity, the cyber threat doesn't require that. You can do it from anywhere. And I think it's still hard for some folks to really understand that they may be a target. And I think the incident that was published or publicized here at the beginning of the year, where there was an Iranian attack on a really small dam in a really small town in kind of the Hudson Valley area, just illustrates that it can be anybody. It's a matter of these folks are really just kind of walking around the internet, if you will, knocking on open doors. So one of the simplest things is to close the doors. And trying to articulate and explain that is something that I know EPA has been involved with, as well as our colleagues at DHS. And we're embarking on a process right now to kind of evaluate different means for building education and awareness within the sector to help support the implementation with some support from the Department of Homeland Security. So we're grateful for that. The support and incentivization of voluntary action, I still think it's a little bit hard to kind of monetize the return on investment, because an entity can spend lots and lots of money on all these different controls and not have clarity on whether or not it's really providing value. So what's been interesting is that the market has been responding, and insurance underwriters and bonding agencies are at least investigating and asking questions about whether or not entities have a cyber risk management plan in place. And some of that does end up pointing back to the NIST or the AWA guidance as a baseline of demonstrating some performance. And I think the last one here on mitigation is what really matters to the owner-operator. Getting back to my point that a number of these vulnerabilities are from decades ago and they haven't been acted on, is the challenge that a utility faces is that you can't just, it's not like a Microsoft update where, well, if this Outlook update doesn't work, maybe my email will be down for a day or so, and that's okay. Well, for a water utility, the thought that the treatment plant or the wastewater plant would be out of service because of some glitch in the software package that didn't jive with some other operating system is really not very appetizing. And so having a more robust dialogue and discussion about what are the least disruptive means by which mitigation actions can be delivered. So it has been frustrating. We get some pretty good intelligence on ABC threat, but then it's not clear that the mitigation associated with that has been vetted in an operational sense. So sort of sandboxing some of these things to ensure that utilities like a water utility aren't going to have bigger problems because of the mitigation or the solution or the so-called solution. And again, there is a little bit of limitation. While a water utility can take a number of different policy and procedure things, and I apologize, this is a little bit dated, but probably not all that off base. The point here with this graphic is that we're somewhat dependent on the technology providers to step up to the plate and provide solutions to the security needs that we have. And so if, to use an analogy, if you can only buy square tires, you're not going to really probably meet EPA's mileage expectations for, carbon footprint reduction and things of that nature. And so we need a collaborative process where the technology providers are putting forward products, and many of them are now, that really meet those needs and allow security to be a core feature of that functionality. And then finally, just as I'll thank Peter here, but there was an acknowledgement in EPA's response to that executive order that the guidance and use case tool that we did develop with collaboration with EPA was supportive of implementing the cybersecurity framework and supports a voluntary risk management strategy associated with cybersecurity. So we are working with our federal colleagues and would hope to see continued support in that area, and certainly welcome any input from the labs in advancing the capacity of the sector to take appropriate actions in mitigating such risks. And for those interested in the guidance and tool, that's the link that you can get at it by, and it is freely available to anybody that is interested. So with that, I'll turn things back over to y'all.